Good morning, ma'am. We are the Group 2. Topic: Reason and impartially as minimum requirements of morality. Objectives: Discuss reason and impartially as minimum requirements of morality. The 7-step moral reasoning model. Apply the 7-step moral reasoning by giving example. So first, let's define the meaning of reason and impartiality. So what is reason? So reason is ability of mind to think, understand from judgment by a process of logic. Innate and exclusive of human ability that utilizes new or existing information as basis to consciously make sense out of things while applying logic. It is also associated with thinking, cognition, and intellect. Next is the impartiality. Impartiality is manifesting objectivity. Is the quality of being unbiased and objective in creating moral decisions, underscoring that a morally impartial person makes moral decisions relative to the welfare of the majority and not for specific people alone.
Why reason impartiality considered as a minimum requirement for morality? Because morality is always required that impartiality with respect to violating moral rules. It must be possible to violate a moral rule and still be acting impartially in this respect. Reason is the base of the motive for an action, decision, or conviction. As a call it refers to the capacity of logical, rational, and analytic thought for consciously making sense of things, establishing and verifying facts, applying common sense and logic, and justifying, and if necessary, changing practices, institution, and belief based on existing or new existing information. It is also spells the difference of moral judgment from more expression of personal reference. In this case, moral judgments, they require backing by reason. Thus, reason commands what it commands, regardless of our feelings, attitude, opinion, and desires. Impartiality involves the idea that each individual's interests and point of view are equally important. It is a principle of justice holding that decision ought to be based on objective criteria, rather than on the basis of bias, prejudice, or preferring the benefit to one person over another improper reason. Impartiality in morality requires that we give equal and or equidate consideration to the interests of concerned parties. In the principle of impartiality assumes that in every person, generally speaking, is equally important. That is, no one is the sin intrinsically more significant than anyone else.
The 7-step moral reasoning model. Moral reasoning is sometimes affected by emotions which blinds us from deciding and seeing what acts are needed to do what is right from wrong. So, in order to decide and do what is actually right, we must do these steps in order to fairly do an act and not be biased about anything. So, the first step is to gather the facts. Some moral dilemmas can be resolved just by clarifying facts of the case. Pero, para sa mga more complex cases, kailangan talagang nag-gather muna tayo ng facts bago tayo gumawa ng any ethical analysis and reflection of the case. In examining a case, kailangan nating malaman yung mga available facts na meron and pati na rin yung mga facts na presently not known pero kailangang ma-determine. We must ask not only what do we know in order to generate an intelligent ethical decision.
Determine the ethical issues. The moral issues should be correctly stated in terms of competing interests. It is these conflicting interests that practically make for a moral dilemma. The issues must be presented in a P versus Q format to reflect
the interests that are colliding in a specific moral dilemma. For instance, many ethical decisions, especially at the end of a patient's life, can be stated in terms of patient autonomy or someone's right to make his or her decision about medical care versus the sanctity of life, the duty of preserve life. Ethical issues occur when a given decision, scenario, or activity creates a conflict with a society's moral principles. These conflicts are somewhat legally dangerous since some of the alternatives to solve the issues might breach a particular law.
3. Identify the principles that have a bearing on the case. In any moral dilemma, there are sure moral values or principles that are vital to the rival position being taken. It is very significant to recognize the principles, and in some cases, to decide whether some principles are to be weighted more heavily than others. So, in any moral dilemma, paniguradong may moral values or principles that are important in competing position. It is critical to identify the principle, pero it is very important na makapag-identify ng principle sa isang case. And sa ibang case daw ay nagde-decide pa sila kung ano ba yung mas matimbang na principle.
The fourth step is list the alternatives. This step involves coming up with the various alternative courses of action as part of the creative thinking included in resolving a moral dilemma. Though there will be some alternatives which you will rule out without much thought, in general, the more alternatives that are listed, the better the chance that your list will include some high-quality ones. Also, you may come up with some very creative alternatives that you had not considered before. So basically, para magkaroon ka ng reasonable and impartial or unbiased decision kapag meron kang pinagdadaan ng moral dilemma, kailangan mong mag-list ng some alternatives at yung mga alternatives na ito ay yung mga plans or yung mga bagay na gagawin mo to make that decision. And these alternatives ay meron siyang kanya-kanyang process and procedure. May mga iba't ibang causes and effects sa mga tao or sa buhay mo. Kailangan mong ilista yung mga alternatives na ito para pagpilian kung ano nga ba yung mas better na magiging decision mo when you encounter a moral dilemma. So the more alternatives that you will list in your listahan, syempre, the more chances na magkakaroon ka ng mas effective and mas magkakaroon ka ng magandang outcome sa magiging decision mo.
Step number 5, compare the alternatives with the principles. This step involves that eliminating alternatives according to the moral principles that have a bearing on this case. In many cases, the case will be resolved at this point. Since the principles will remove all alternatives except one, the purpose of this comparison is to determine is not forthcoming, then the next step is the model should be considered. Some of the alternative, at the least, may be rejected by the step of
Step
comparison.
6. Assess the consequences. So we need to assess the consequences so that we identify who will be affected by our own decision and how the decision is likely to affect them. And also, think of its long term. And isipin natin yung positive consequences because it's more beneficial than others.
Make a decision. Whatever you choose in the first 6 steps, it is very important for the last step because you have to make a decision based on your assessment on the first 6 steps. So normally, the decisions that you're going to make here is one that possess the least number of problems or negative consequences, not one that is devoid of them.
Scenario example to apply the 7-step reasoning model. So the case is a 20-year-old Hispanic male was brought to a hospital for injuries, but was released shortly. He admitted to the doctor that he was HIV positive and is gay. His sister at home was willing to take care of him until he was fully recovered. He asked his doctor that she not be told that he had tested HIV positive. He had fear that his father would hear of his homosexuality. So the moral dilemma is the doctor bound by his code of confidentiality, but the patient's sister, without knowing the truth, is putting herself at risk by providing care for his brother. Should the doctor breach confidentiality to safeguard the patient's sister? Ray offers a model with these steps in making moral decisions. Apply the 7-step moral reasoning by giving examples. So, first we need to gather the facts. Kailangan nating alamin yung mga totoong nangyari. So, based on the case, may lalaking 20 years old Hispanic ang dinala sa hospital because he has injuries, pero nilabas din naman siya agad. And inamin niya sa doktor that he has HIV positive and gay. And also, willing siyang alagaan ng kapatid niyang babae hanggang gumaling siya, pero sinabi niya sa doktor na huwag sabihin sa kapatid niyang babae na he had tested HIV positive. The other fact is that the patient got injuries or wounded dahil sa isang gang violence, and he probably fears rejection and perhaps retribution from his fellow gang members, especially kapag nalaman nilang he is HIV positive. And another fact is that yung kapatid na babae ng patient would be changing fairly sizable wound dressing for his brother, and the chances are high that she would came into contact with his HIV-infected blood.
Determine the ethical issues. The conflict is the need for patient confidentiality versus the duty to warn the sister of risk of harm. Determine the ethical issues. Duty is the foundation of morality. If an action has the potential to become a universal law of society, it is considered moral. When determining the morality of an act, you must consider both the doer and the recipient's perspective.
So in this scenario, merong 4 na alternatives na nilista na pwedeng pagpilian ng doktor na gagawin niya about sa decision niya about sa sa confidential information ng kanyang patient. So first is tell the sister that her brother is HIV positive. Second is to refuse to tell her that information. And the other alternatives third alternatives is warn the patient's sister in general terms about taking suitable precaution for taking these types of wounds. And last alternative is to request the patient to inform his sister of his condition and request that she not tell any other family member or any of his friends. So those are the alternatives na pwedeng pagpilian ng doktor. It's either pwede niyang sabihin na lang sa sister ng patient na yung brother niya is HIV positive or hindi. Or pwede namang sabihin niya in general na yung pag-take care sa kanyang kapatid is ganito ganyan, kailangan laging naka-gloves kasi nga 'di ba yung HIV is sa dugo. So kailangan laging naka-gloves, laging nagwo-wash ng hands para hindi maapektuhan yung yung sister niya sa contaminated na dugo ng kanyang brother. Or pwedeng pakiusapan na lang ng doktor yung patient niya na sabihin na lang yung totoo sa kanyang sister, and or magkaroon siya ng trust sa kanyang sister na hindi na lang din ipagsasabi ng sister niya. So those are the alternatives na pwedeng pagpilian ng doktor na gagawin niya para magkaroon siya ng reasonable and impartial decision sa kanyang moral dilemma na kinakaharap.
Compare the alternatives with the principles, encouraging the universal precautions for the sister but not telling her why. Come close to satisfying all the pertinent principle.
Assess the consequences. Telling the sister or insisting that the patient tell his sister has these likely consequences. So, ito yung kahinatnan pag sinabi niya sa kapatid niya yung problema o yung sitwasyon niya. A. The sister would be saved from the risk of developing a fatal illnesses. So, maliligtas o hindi mahahawaan yung kapatid niya sa sakit. B. The brother's HIV status would be out in the open family. So, kapag sinabi niya sa kapatid niya yung sitwasyon, syempre, sasabihin niya sa family nila para aware din sila. C. Trust with the physician suffers. The patient may refuse to see doctors, which is unfortunate since he will need ongoing medical care. The physician refusing to disclose the information may have these consequences. So, ito naman yung kahihinatnan pag pumayag yung doktor na hindi sabihin yung totoo na may HIV yung patient. A. The sister would be vulnerable to contracting an infection for which there is no cure. So, mahahawa daw yung kapatid niyang babae sa impeksyong walang lunas. B. The patient's HIV status is well-kept secret, as his homosexuality, but it is not likely that either his HIV status or homosexuality can be kept secret forever. C. Trust between the physician and patient is maintained.
Making a decision. In this scenario, there are 3 questions that you have to answer in making a decision. Number 1. Which principles are most weighty? If we are going to compare between the 2 principles given, the second principle is likely to be more weighty, which states that the duty of the physician to warn interested parties other than the patient if they are at risk of looming harm. Because if the physician is going to protect the information being kept about the patient having HIV, it might cause a bigger harm to those people around the patient who don't know the real situation. Number 2. Which alternatives are the most variable? Based on the given alternative, letter B is likely to be more variable. It says that request the patient to inform his sister of his condition and request that she would not tell any other family members or any of his friends. Number 3. Which consequences seem to you the most severe? According to the given consequences, letter A is the most severe one. It says that the sister would be vulnerable to contracting an infection for which there is no cure, because nothing is more serious than putting some innocent's life in danger that could have been prevented if not because for some selfish reasons.
Member Group 2, Ancheta, Cayapan, Francisco, Guagua, Hugo, Orias, Ubaldo. And that's all. Thank you for listening. Have a good day.